Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Deckman, the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, and I'm inviting you today to our very first Q&A that we're featuring on our Substack platform. I'm delighted to be joined by Ruth Braunstein. Ruthie is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut, where she directs the Meanings of Democracy Lab. She is a longtime friend of PRRI. She serves on our board. We're delighted to share that. We also have worked together in a research capacity as well. Last fall, PRI joined forces with Ruthie's Meanings of Democracy Lab to put together a report that really looks at the pluralistic resistance to Christian nationalism using American Values Atlas data from PRRI. We're here today to discuss Ruthie's new podcast series, When the Wolves Came. And so I'm really delighted to welcome you, Ruth, to our Q&A. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa.
Terrific. Well, I actually just wanted to first start out by asking you what inspired the podcast? As scholars, we're writing books, we're writing peer-reviewed articles, maybe writing op-eds as well. But what led you to use this medium to discuss Christian nationalism and threats to our democracy in this way?
Yeah, so for a couple years, I have been tracking the many organizations that have emerged in the past decade or so to resist Christian nationalism. One of the stories that I really felt wasn't getting that much attention, in part because it wasn't happening that loudly or publicly, was an emerging resistance within the evangelical world. We've heard a lot about evangelical pastors jumping on board with the Christian nationalist movement, or being silenced or pushed out. But it turned out that a couple of those pastors actually were able to sort of get through that first moment and stay and use their voices within their church to voice a resistance to Christian nationalism. And I thought that that was a story that was worth telling, for a number of reasons. One reason just being that I think it's really affirming to people who are outside of evangelical spaces and are often accused of kind of finger pointing, and saying, those people over there are doing something problematic, right? But when people from within that community itself are saying, no, we see it too, and we are willing to stand up and talk about it, I think that that can be a place for building some bridges of connection between different parts of this resistance effort. And also, I think it's just at the end of the day, it's a very personal story for a lot of the people who are experiencing the sort of takeover of their churches by these really outside political forces. And it's been really painful for a lot of people. It's been really divisive for communities. And I think getting to see that up close can be different than reading about it third hand or in a news article or seeing the kind of high level data that's really shaped how we understand that situation.
So what led you to Phoenix? Like, why did you choose the churches that you did? And maybe tell our listeners a little bit about the background of those churches.
So our story focuses on one pastor, Pastor Caleb Campbell, who leads a mid-sized church in Phoenix called Desert Springs Bible Church. And he has really emerged as a leading voice in some of these evangelical conversations about the the harms of Christian nationalism to both the church and to democracy. But when we first found him, he was not quite he hadn't quite risen to the level that he has managed to sort of gain a bigger audience today. But what really drew us to his story was how local all of the forces that we had been tracking at a national level really find themselves playing out inside of this local community. And so one of the sort of really key parts of his story is that in 2020, as Donald Trump rose to power, as COVID hit, as Black Lives Matter protests were really roiling the national political conversation and in the streets, he lost 80% of his congregants. And it's a story that we know has happened all over the country. But he was not fired. He was not pushed out. He stayed on at the church and he watched as the people that he had been, in community with for years and years went 12 minutes down the street in many cases to a mega church that in that same moment invited Donald Trump to speak at their church and really became a central node in the broader Christian nationalist movement. They partnered with Turning Point USA, who is led by Charlie Kirk and is a really central figure in this right-wing movement. And so we had just in this, small city, this microcosm of forces that were happening all over the country, but you could see it literally happening in the case of these two churches. And we found that really a useful place to talk through these dynamics.
Yeah, I do agree. Caleb is such a compelling figure. I mean, his backstory is interesting, obviously, but one of the things I was really struck with is we know that many pastors, and you relate this in your series, are often face they often face extraordinary pressure to really not talk about politics, even though maybe their own inner voice is telling them that these trends toward anti-democratic kind of values are not necessarily good or biblical even. So I just thought that was a really, really interesting choice for Caleb here. What would you say were some of the major takeaways from the whole series? Like, what did you say that you learned? Maybe things that surprised you?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple things. I mean, one is something that Caleb himself repeated over and over again. And we talked to his board chair at the time, and he said the same thing, which was that they felt like they had not changed their message at all. They, for years, had been talking about racial reconciliation and structural racism. They, for years, had been talking about serving immigrants. They, for years, had been talking about a number of issues. And so the way that they say it is, we didn't change, they changed, meaning the reaction of their congregants changed and suddenly started to mark those specific issues as quote unquote political, and not just political, but liberal and Marxist. And so there's something that was happening there. And what we came to sort of explore by talking to them and experts and reading, more about this is really the media environment shifted. And the media environment, which we know has a profound influence on how people understand the world, and really PRRI data has isolated the unique, distinctive worldview of particularly those Fox News conservatives, right? It's way beyond Fox News now, right? Fox News is kind of like the moderate version of that. And so, we talk to people, they're really consuming a wide variety of right-wing news sources. And that that had taken them farther down the road to sort of extreme views than I think I had fully appreciated. And so one of the pieces of PRI data that we cite and that we talked to Robbie about is the data on QAnon adherence and the questions that we ask as survey researchers and scholars to assess whether people um, essentially are QAnon adherents. And there was, I think, a sense that once Q stopped making drops, that the influence of those views was going to decline. But what we really found was that the core kind of kernel of those views, this idea that there is a conspiracy of liberals, Democrats, global elites that are in many different ways working to harm children, that had really just absolutely pervaded the views of people in the pews in this megachurch that we visited. And it was being, reinforced from the pulpit by people like Charlie Kirk. And it came through in every issue that they talked about: immigration policy, book banning sort of concerns, LGBTQ rights, trans athletes in sports. Like all of those issues, the dots that connected them were a conspiracy to harm kids. And and so just the extent that that had really spread and become common sense to people who maybe had never even heard of QAnon was really, really surprised even me. And then the last piece I'll say is that, I think and I hope that people take from this that there are many white evangelical Christians who are conservative, politically conservative, theologically, that more liberal, progressive, or secular people may not think of as allies, who care really deeply about some of the same fundamental values, which have to do with religious freedom, religious pluralism, and the sort of ability to live with people that they disagree with, and are working really hard to promote those values in their community and beyond. And so trying to think about where there might be places in this highly divided, partisan, polarized political world where people can work together around those basics of a pluralistic democracy.
Kind of stemming from that last point that you raised, what kind of practical advice would you give people who are listening to the series, who really are very concerned about the state of democracy, but still have very deeply held religious values?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing for perhaps for evangelical listeners, we really wanted to make sure that, to be clear that I am not myself an evangelical Christian, but that we're trying to lift up the voices of people inside that community. Talk to a guy named Nab Nasworth, who's a political scientist, a journalist, and now runs an organization called the American Values Coalition. And he really suffered personally in his career by speaking out against this, but now has found himself leading an organization that I love the story of this organization. The original idea for it came from a Democrat who found that he was really not able to have productive conversations with members of his family that he loved. And so he wanted to be able to create an organization that was able to kind of bridge those divides. And it's an organization led by that is for conservative evangelicals, and Knapp is leading it. It is funded in part, though, by a prominent atheist. So it's a real, I think, story in miniature of how people who probably disagree on a whole lot of things, disagree on policy even, can agree on those basics. And the way Knapp describes it is they're against Christian nationalism and they're concerned about the sort of foundations of our democracy. So they were able to find a way to work together.
Great. So, how would you describe the reception to the podcast series?
It's been really positive. And one of the things that was really important to us, was that we kind of did good by the people that we talked to. Like we absolutely did not want anyone to feel like we were playing gotcha, or warping their stories. And we've heard some really positive feedback from the people in the podcast who feel like we represented them truly and helped them feel like seen and heard. And that was really important to us. We've also heard from people within the evangelical world who are telling us, I think you got this just right. People actually in both churches that we focus on, who are saying that I may not like your message, but I think you got it just right, and I can't quibble with any of the facts. Or people who are like, thank you for lifting up these voices. And then people who are maybe not quite as sympathetic to white evangelicals, which I think is a lot of our audience, who said that we helped them think differently about the work that those folks are doing, and that, lots of people asking to be connected to Caleb and to the work of these organizations, and who, I don't think necessarily would have thought of them as good partners before, and maybe have given them a second look.
Terrific. Well, Ruthie, congratulations on the podcast. I think it's really so well done and compelling. Um, I wanted to leave you though with the chance to talk about your new book. Ruthie is obviously very busy these days,
Mhm.
so let's tell our audience a little bit about the new book you have dropping.
The new book is called My Tax Dollars, The Morality of Tax Paying in America. And it might seem quite far afield from the topic of the podcast, but it really has a lot of the same ingredients. It's about religion, it's about resistance, it's about money, and just like I was drawn to the story of these resistors, a relatively small ragtag bunch of resistors within the evangelical world. The book is about people who are thinking about resistance using their tax dollars. So it looks at anti-war activists who are doing tax resistance. It looks at anti-abortion activists doing tax resistance, and anti-government activists who don't believe that taxation is valid. And the real bottom line is that through all those stories, it makes visible the ways that tax paying in general for all of us, whether we realize it or not, is really a way that we understand our relationships to each other and our relationship to government. It's about the social contract itself more than about any specifics of policy. And so I like to repeat over and over again that tax debates are very rarely just about tax rates. And I'm excited to start talking more about the book in the coming weeks.
Wonderful. Well, best of luck with the podcast and the new book. And please, everyone who's listening, check out the new book and check out Ruthie's new Substack as well, which is Democracy is Hard. And I think we can all agree on that these days. So thank you very much, Ruthie.
Thanks so much, Melissa.